I often read comments in YouTube videos featuring William Lane Craig that accuse him of being a liar or a con artist. When I ask these people what Craig has lied about, they don't point to specific statements he has made that are clear-cut cases of deliberate falsehoods. Rather, they seem to think that because they disagree with him, that he must be lying. These people are so convinced of their atheism that they think anyone who professes to be religious is lying. This strikes me as narcissistic and bullheaded. While I don't think that Craig is a liar or a con artist, there is a proposition he holds to that he stubbornly refuses to justify. In 1995, Dr. Craig debated a man named Corey Washington. During the debate, Washington read about a man dying from a horrible disease. When it was Craig's turn to speak, he said that Washington had appealed to the audience's emotions. But this is exactly what Craig did 2 years later when an opponent challenged him to justify the second premise of his moral argument.
But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it. There is no more reason to deny the existence of objective moral values than the existence of objective physical objects in the world. Actions like rape, torture, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. But if objective values cannot exist without God, and objective values do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists.
And then the third one, God makes sense of objective moral values in the world. I don't think objective moral values are a fact to be explained. It's not a given datum. So I don't see how one could set up the argument in that way. If God is going to be the best explanation for something, that needs to be a datum, and the existence of objective moral values, that's a philosophical theory. That's not a datum. Dr. Craig first needs to prove that there are objective moral values before he can claim that to be a datum to be explained.
Third, God makes sense of objective moral values in the world. Here he seems to deny that objective moral values exist. And I would submit that that's simply contrary to our best moral intuitions. As Michael Roos himself admits, the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Will Dr. Drange get up and actually say that he thinks that the rape and torture of a child is a morally neutral act? I can't believe that he would.
Craig is asking Drange a loaded question. His question assumes the very issue under consideration, namely, whether objective moral values exist. Here's Craig's argument in syllogistic form. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. Premise 2 is highly contestable, for Premise 2 contends that moral realism is true. Moral realism is not entailed by the truth of Premise 1. In other words, Premise 1 could be true, and Premise 2 could be false. Or even the conclusion if considered in isolation from the rest of Craig's arguments. In other words, God could exist, but morality might be conventional. Craig has another response when challenged to justify Premise 2, but it also misses the mark. Here's a clip of Craig jousting with Robert Lawrence Kuhn over Premise 2.
What else do you have in your bag of tricks of arguments?
Well, there's the moral argument for God's existence, and this would say that if there is no God, then there really are no objective moral values and duties. On this view, unless there is God to serve as an anchor point for moral values and duties, moral values and duties are just the products of socio-biological evolution. And on this view, without God, everything is relative. Human beings are just relatively advanced primates, and moral values are just something we've evolved to get along in society without killing each other off.
This argument to me sounds different in that you need to assume the absolutism of moral values. In the other arguments, you're assuming the the reality of a beginning and a world, which I think everybody admits. But when you deal with moral questions, you have to make the assumption that there are absolute moral values as opposed to relative values.
That's right.
Because if you don't have absolute values, then you certainly don't need God.
I prefer to speak of objective moral values, by which I mean mind-independent values. And you're right, that would be the second step of the argument, would be to say, but there are objective moral values and duties. That is a premise in the argument. And I think
that's an assumption.
Well, it's a premise. I don't think it's just an assumption. I think that there's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than there is to deny the objective reality of the physical world.
Well, that's a strong statement.
Right. And any argument that you could give me for denying the objective reality of moral values, I could construct a parallel argument for being skeptical about the objective reality of the external world. If we trust our sensory intuitions that there is a world of objects independent of us out there, I don't think we have any grounds for distrusting our moral intuitions of the realm of objective values.
Yeah. Craig is assuming that anyone who would deny objective moral values must be committed to realism with respect to the external world, but it's hard to see why. Why couldn't, for example, an idealist ask him to justify premise 2? And just because he could make a case for anti-realism, it doesn't follow that moral realism is true. After all, realism with respect to the external world and moral values could both be philosophically untenable. If Craig is not assuming that anyone who would deny objective moral values must be committed to realism with respect to the external world, then what difference does it make if he could construct an argument for anti-realism? The justificatory status of premise 2 is unrelated to the status of the external world. Since Craig refuses to justify premise 2, his moral argument is invalid. Craig doesn't want to give the argument up, so he stubbornly clings to it, offering question-begging and sophistical responses to its challengers. He should abandon the argument and base his justification of objective morality from the top down, arguing that if it's reasonable to believe that Christianity is true, then it's reasonable to accept moral realism. I don't believe that Craig is a malicious person. Just because he makes errors doesn't mean that he does so intentionally. I think atheists attack Craig's character because they can't deal with his arguments. He's not someone who can be dismissed as an unsophisticated Bible thumper like Kirk Cameron. Craig has 2 doctorates, and he's more than familiar with the objections to theism and their flaws. Craig is not a bad guy, but he should abandon the moral argument. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and comment.